Hello, everybody. Welcome into the Apples and Genos Fantasy Hockey Podcast. My name is Nate Groot Niblink. I'm the creator of Apples and Genos, originator of the ZeroG draft strategy. And this podcast, I'm going to do my yearly review of how that ZeroG draft strategy performed in 2024-25, and we'll see if there's any new information we can use to improve or modify the strategy for next year. Let's get it. Welcome back. Let's get into it. Well, before I get started, I am going to once again give my canned statement on the ZeroG strategy, which I've given probably, I don't know, a dozen times on this podcast, but still doesn't quite seem to make it out there into the collective conscious too often. Basically, I just want to say I'm not the first person to fade goalies in fantasy hockey drafts. I've never claimed to be that person, but ZeroG is far more than just fading goalies. I've personally put years of research and theory into fashioning the strategy as a whole into a holistic approach to the goaltender position in fantasy hockey, and one that has an application and an action for every stage of the fantasy season, not just the draft. This is, my single largest and best contribution to the fantasy hockey community. And as you can imagine, I do take a ton of pride in having created something that's already helped hundreds of fantasy managers beat their rivals. And that is why I mention it at the top of every episode. With all that said, I've kind of been playing around with a slightly updated version of the ZeroG draft strategy, like the most concise definition that I can possibly give, the elevator pitch, if you will. But this is what I've come up with. Yeah, it might change slightly, the wording, but I think everybody should at least get the thesis from the basic statement. So this is what I've come up with. Goaltenders are the most replaceable and the least predictable players on your fantasy roster. Therefore, we should try to reduce the amount of draft capital we spend on goaltenders to a minimum while still correctly weighing the upside/risk profile of a goalie pick versus a skater pick throughout your draft. In season, we should view goalies as dispensable at all times and not tolerate underperforming goalies on our rosters when we know that top tier goalie performances are available on the wire at all times. So that's what I'm going with as of now. Maybe I'll make some minor adjustments here or there in the future, but that's what I'm going with at this current moment. And I think that kind of gets across a little bit better than what I'd said previously, a little bit better now where I'm at with the strategy and what I'm trying to convey to people when I talk about it. That's probably as concise as I can get it. There's definitely a lot more nuance to it here and there, and we'll talk about some of that nuance in the episode here today, but I want to kind of give that definition here to kind of set the stage for what we're going to talk about here. All right, so first off, I am going to be following the kind of basic premise that I did in last year's episode. So if you did catch that one last year when I did the kind of ZeroG season in review for the 2023-24 season, I'm going to be following a similar framework here. But basically off the top, this is something that I've been tracking year by year over the last 5 years now. So I've got 5 years worth of data on this. And this is basically trying to track goaltenders by ADP and kind of the first 14 goaltenders off the board by ADP versus the next 14. So goaltenders 1 through 14 by ADP versus goaltenders 15 through 28. And this kind of just gives you a quick and dirty idea of the goaltenders that everybody expects to be good versus the goaltenders that everybody has some pretty major qualms about once you get down further, and kind of how they perform relative to each other. So what I've done with these is, of those goaltenders ranked 1 through 14, I have taken their end of season rank in total fantasy points. And here I'm using the Cacuffle fantasy points system. If you want to check that out, I'll leave a link to it in the show description here. But basically it's just I mean, a lot of goaltender point systems, you have some weight for wins, you have some weight for saves, you have minus for goals against, you have some weight for shutouts. A lot of them are very similar. Usually it's, 5 saves equals 1 goal against in terms of averaging each other out. And then really the more variance you get in a lot of leagues is how much weight you place on wins. I think a couple has kind of very run of the mill status in terms of how it's weighting all those things and how it's weighting them relative to skater points as well. So I think that's a relatively good way to use this moving forward. But yeah, if you want to check that out, I will leave a link in the show description. But for these goaltenders, so if we look at the goaltenders by ADP rank 1 through 14, what is their end of season average rank in total fantasy points and then also in fantasy points per game, so average fantasy points. So those goaltenders 1 through 14, if you're watching on YouTube here, I've got this up on the screen. In 2021, goaltenders by ADP 1 through 14, at the end of the season, their average rank, so where they finished at the end of the season in total fantasy points, was 25.6, which is obviously not terrific. The average fantasy points per game played, 27.2, which is even worse. And then if you go down to the goalies by ADP rank 15 through 28, so the next 14 goaltenders off the board by average draft position, they actually outperformed the 1 through 14 goaltenders in both total fantasy points and fantasy points per game in the 2020-21 season. Now, that was one of the COVID shortened seasons. It was probably the craziest goaltender season for a lot of reasons, but definitely the shortened season playing into that as well and creating a lot of variance in those numbers. So we now obviously have 4 more seasons beyond that. And actually, the season after 21-22 was a lot better season for the goaltenders ranked 1 through 14 by ADP. Then it kind of bounced back the other way in 22-23. Came back up a little bit in 23-24, and this past season is actually the worst season for goaltenders by ADP rank 1 through 14 since that 2020-2021 COVID shortened season. So in this past season, 2024-25, goaltenders by ADP rank 1 through 14, so the first 14 goaltenders off the board, ended the season ranked on average 20.6 in total fantasy points and 25.1 in average fantasy points. And then the next 14 goaltenders off the board, goaltenders 15 through 28, in total fantasy points, they average ranked 23.9, and fantasy points per game average rank 23.0. So not that far behind in total fantasy points and actually ahead of the first 14 goaltenders in fantasy points per game played. I did use a cutoff here. You had to win at least 10 games to make it into these stats. I didn't want to have, goaltenders playing 1 game factoring into these fantasy points per games played. If they had 1 game in the NHL the entire season and that was a shutout, obviously that would skew the numbers a lot. So I did make it that every goaltender on this list to be included in this list had to have at least 10 games won by the end of the season. So yeah, what we can draw from this 24, 25, if you're just looking holistically, the kind of top goaltenders versus the next tier of goaltenders, which I think is a pretty good method. Oftentimes you'll get somewhere around 28 goaltenders drafted in a lot of drafts, 12-team league, if what would that be? 8 teams draft 3 goaltenders, and then you've got. No, that math doesn't make sense. I shouldn't have tried to do math on live on the podcast, that's for sure. But basically, if you have 12 teams, each team drafts, as long as each team drafts 2 goaltenders, you assume that'd be 24 goaltenders in a 12-team league. And then we have 4 extra goaltenders. So maybe 4 of those 12 teams each draft a 3rd goaltender. Something like that is pretty standard. And so you're representing, on average, those 28 goaltenders in these stats here. And you're just kind of comparing the top drafted goaltenders to the bottom drafted goaltenders. And what you're seeing is very close results in 24-25 in both total total fantasy points and fantasy points per game, and actually the later goaltenders outperforming the top goaltenders in fantasy points per game, which has not always been the case. In fact, it's only happened before in that 2020-21 season, but it is something where it's usually a lot closer than you would think at the beginning of the year. So that's what happened in 24-25. Very tough season for top-ranked goaltenders, I would say. They came down more so than the bottom-ranked goaltenders came up, although the bottom-ranked goaltenders did come up a little bit relative to previous seasons as well. So just looking kind of at the top goaltenders, so I've got this sorted here by Yahoo ADP rank, just to kind of go through them a little bit, just to highlight, I guess, some of the more notable goaltenders. So the number one goaltender off the board I also have Cacupful ADP up here as well, just for reference. If you despise Yahoo ADP and you think you want to only be looking at something like Cacupful, which is made up of probably more knowledgeable fantasy managers on average, it doesn't actually differ that much until you get pretty significantly further down. So that is of note. But yeah, across the top, Igor Shesterkin was the number one goaltender off the board in both sets of ADP data. Actually, the first four were all the same. Shesterkin, then Hellebuyck, then Saros, then Ottinger were 1, 2, 3, 4 in both sets of data. So Shesterkin obviously did not have a great season. People thought he was the surest thing as a goaltender, but he posted 286 goals against average, 905 save percentage, only 27 wins. He finished sixth in Cacupful total points ranked, but 16th in points per game. In average points. So that's obviously not a great season for Shesterkin. He kind of got there by volume alone, which, he finished as a middling kind of top tier goaltender by just sheer volume. So he didn't maybe completely submarine you on the actual total fantasy points, but definitely he wasn't as good as people thought he would be. You really, looking across these top goaltenders, these top 14 goaltenders, you can't really blame injury here either. Only Thatcher Demko and Frederick Anderson among these top 14 goaltenders by Yahoo ADP played less than 44 games. The top 11 goaltenders by Yahoo ADP all played 49 games or more. So pretty solid amount of games played. It wasn't, due to injury or lingering injury for a lot of these players. They all played a fairly solid complement of games. You have UC Saros. He was drafted third amongst goaltenders, posted an 896. Swayman drafted fifth, posted an 892. Stuart Skinner drafted eighth, posted an 896. Georgiev drafted ninth, posted an 875. Was traded to the Sharks before the new year, which definitely wasn't on a lot of managers' radars, especially those who were drafting him. Ninth amongst goaltenders. Ilya and Sorokin and Thatcher Demko would have gone higher if not for injury concerns. Both were pretty bad. Sorokin did kind of rescue his save percentage with a great last half of the season, but really put his managers behind the eight ball early in the season for the first half. Even Jake Ottinger, 909 save percentage, Sergei Bobrovsky, 906 save percentage. They were a lot more volume dependent, win dependent than really good or really setting you apart at the goaltender position. There were plenty of other goaltenders with comparable save percentages. They didn't really set themselves apart in that regard. If you start to get further down, this is where you start to get some really huge hits. You have Darcy Kemper, 20th off the board. He posts a 202 goals against average, 926 save percentage, 31 wins. Terrific season from Darcy Kemper. Anthony Stolarz was 21st off the board. Only played 34 games, did miss some games with injury and split time with Joseph Wall, but he won 21 of those 34 games, 214 goals against average, 926 save percentage for him as well. Philip Gustafsson was a huge hit, 24th. He did fade a bit down the stretch with an injured team and a big workload, but finished the year still with a 256 goals against average and a 914 save percentage. You've got Logan Thompson, was drafted 26th overall, or among goaltenders on average. Was kind of the story of the year for a hot minute before he got hurt and won 31 of 42 starts, 910 save percentage there. Dustin Wolf was drafted 34th on average, emerged as a true workhorse for the Calgary Flames, posted a 264 goals against average and 910 save percentage on a non-playoff team. Mackenzie Blackwood was undrafted everywhere, obviously dominated once he arrived in Colorado, 233 goals against average and 913 save percentage when he was on Colorado. You have Karel Vejmelka, Kevin Lankinen, Lucas Dostal, Elvis Merzlikins, Cam Talbot, Sam Montembeault. Others had significant stretches of play where they were just simply better options for fantasy than most of the highly drafted goaltenders. So, yeah, once again, I think you can see from this list, you did still get some pretty huge hits later on in the draft, undrafted goaltenders as well, like Mackenzie Blackwood, through sets of circumstances where you could pick him up off the wire when that trade happened, and all of a sudden you have a locked and loaded number one goaltender for your fantasy team for the rest of the season. All right, let's keep moving along. Let's get into really just a analysis kind of quarter by quarter. So I've divided the season up into 4 quarters by date, more or less. So the actual games played may vary a little bit within these, but I tried to divide it as evenly as possible just by the date, so the number of days throughout the season from start to finish. And really, what I'm trying to do here is just highlight the variance of the goaltending position throughout the course of the season. A lot of times we tunnel vision on the current set of circumstances that we're seeing. And a lot of times at the end of the year, we only really are thinking about the goaltenders who performed during the last quarter of the season. But realistically, if you look back, there were goaltenders who gave us really good different parts of the season. And if you were able to piece some of that together, you could actually provide yourself with really good goaltending throughout the course of the season. And it's not as hard as some people might have you believe. So I'm not going to go through, every single piece of the fantasy season, but I do want to pull a few lessons from this data here. So looking at this first quarter here, you have Connor Hellebuyck and UC Saros actually at the top. A lot of people don't remember. UC Saros actually did start pretty well, 918 save percentage in the first 17 games of the season here. So Hellebuyck and Saros were 1-2 in total cupful points here, but then it was Philip Gustafsson, Joey Decord, and Lucas Dostal, 3, 4, and 5 right behind them. So yeah, once again, you have really good performances from guys that nobody was expecting right away, right behind them, right there. Lucas Dostal in a lot of places was probably available on your waiver wire. At least very early in the season. Probably wasn't drafted in a fair number of places. So definitely some good options on that front. If you look a little further down, you get guys like Dustin Wolf, you get guys like Anthony Stolars, who had great starts to the year and were obviously drafted much later as well. So as we progress through this, I just want to note Connor Hellebuyck was the only goalie that ranked in the top 10 in points scored in all 4 quarters of the season. So definitely Hellebuyck had a great year. But I do want to highlight again, people say, of course Hellebuyck had a great year. Okay, but then why weren't we drafting him ahead of Igor Shesterkin, and why was Shesterkin terrible? Again, people tend to use hindsight to overrate their ability to foresee these kinds of seasons coming. If we were so good at that, then we would have taken Hellebuyck over Shesterkin at the beginning of the year, and that was simply not the case on average, either in the Yahoo ADP or the Cupful ADP. In this quarter two, you once again have Gustafsson in the 2 spot. You have Blackwood popping in the 3 spot here. You have Joseph Woll emerging. You have Sam Montembeault emerging. Karel Vejmelka shows up for the first time here as well, a little further down. Let's move on to quarter 3. Vasilevsky tops this list. He had a tremendous stretch through here, just kind of lapped the field, so good on him there. Sorokin shows up here, and Hellebuyck again, but once again, after that, you have Decord, you have Logan Thompson, you have Dustin Wolf. Shesterkin finally makes the list here for the first time in the 3rd quarter. Blackwood shows up again. Merzlikins shows up again. A little bit more by sheer volume, but this was also a stretch where he was actually playing decent, posted a 910 save percentage through these 15 games in the 3rd quarter of the season, and was getting a lot of volume. So he was pretty valuable through this stretch. In the 4th quarter of the season, the final quarter of the season, it's Darcy Kemper who laps the field. Hellebuyck once there again. Ullmark shows up here. Philip Gustafsson is here once again. Vasilevsky's here again. Sorokin. Stolar shows up again at the end of the season. Didn't have quite as much volume, but was unbelievable in this last portion of the season. Montembeau's here again as Montreal goes on that run at the end of the season. Shesterkin gets here on volume, just a 901 save percentage there. Vejmelka as well with that insane 20 game or 20 plus games straight started. 891 save percentage, so it wasn't terrific on that front, but the true volume was there for him to get you some fantasy points there at the end of the year. So just looking through this, what I see is 22 different goaltenders that finished top 10 in points scored in at least one quarter of the season. That's actually the same as last year. So both in 2023-24 and 24-25, we have 22 different goaltenders that finished top 10 in points scored. So you are getting a wide variety of goaltenders. It's not just the same 10 guys through all 4 quarters of the season. That's not how it works. You have, if you divide this further into eighths of the season, so if you divide each quarter into 2 parts as well, then you have 32 different goaltenders. So yeah, more dividing the season into, I think it would be like 22 days on average is an eighth of the season, based on how many days there were in the entire regular season in the NHL last year. So if you subdivide it further, then you get 32 different goaltenders finishing in the top 10 in total points in at least 1/8 of the season. But what I really want to draw from these 4 quarters that I've shown you here is that you are getting multiple chances at a free agent top 10 performance in every single quarter of the season. Obviously, these are arbitrarily set quarters. You can find different portions of the season where you can also get even better and performances from other free agents as well. But if I just kind of choose this arbitrary dividing the season into quarters, which is like a relatively long period of time in NHL terms, it's well over a month. Yeah, I think it'd be, I said eighth was 22 days, so it'd be roughly 44 days, month and a half roughly. It's a relatively long time in terms of the fantasy season. And so you're definitely getting multiple shots at goaltenders like Vejmelka, like Montembeault, like Stolarz in this case with quarter 4 that we see on the screen, but also in all the other quarters you saw as well. Multiple chances at goaltenders that are literally in free agency for you to pick up. And it starts right from the very start of the season. I also did this exercise for fantasy points per game or average points. And that I think might actually have a little bit more interest for me even than total points, just because it gives you an indication of how well the goalie is performing aside from just the volume of starts. You can kind of think of this as the quote unquote startability of the goaltender. How well were they performing when you started them rather than just how many chances they got to accrue points. Obviously, in a points league, maybe you don't care as much. The volume that Vejmelka gave you in this 4th quarter was enough to give him a top 10 performance in total points scored, even though he did only post an 891 save percentage. Shesterkin makes this list kind of by the same virtue there by starting nearly every game for the Rangers down the stretch. So take that into account, but maybe, in your Cats leagues as well, you're a little bit more interested in the average point or in the average points or the points per game number, because that's maybe a little bit more indicative of good goals against average numbers, good save percentage numbers, if those are categories in your Cats league. So you can maybe think about it that way as well. If you do the same exercise, just looking at points per game rather than total points, and rank the goalies 1 through 10 based on that, you end up with 23 different goaltenders that finish top 10 in points per game in at least one quarter of the season, and 38 different goaltenders that finish top 10 in points per game in at least 1/8 of the season. I really like to highlight this data just because I hear people talking all the time about how you have to hit on the correct waiver wire goalies. Like, you just have to be so perfect at picking these goaltenders. And I just don't think it's true. I think you have a lot of data to pick goaltenders. Blackwood gets traded to Colorado Avalanche. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that, hey, maybe Mackenzie Blackwood is worth picking up right now and I should jump on that. You have an injury to Anthony Stolarz, and Joseph Woll goes off for a bit. He's the number 1 goaltender and gets a lot of starts for the Toronto Maple Leafs. Good defensive team. Hey, look, maybe I should go pick up Joseph Woll if he's been dropped in my league. A lot of places he was dropped throughout the course of the season. When Stolarz was maybe taking a little bit more starts, and then Stolarz goes down to injury, you pick up Woll. Lucas Dostal, yeah, he was getting all the starts while Gibson was injured. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to think that, hey, maybe this guy is a guy that's at least going to give me volume, and what if he gives me good rates as well? So, Yeah, I just think we have a lot of data, a lot of just obvious volume that we can see with goaltenders that crops up throughout the season. Like I mentioned, these top goaltenders pretty much did not get injured this season. They were very healthy, and it still didn't really matter. We still got lots of goaltender performances down the list. Undrafted goalies and goalies drafted late in your drafts, 15 through 28 by ADP rank. So you do have those options available to you, but in a season, maybe next year we do have significant injuries to three, four, five of those top goaltenders, and that opens up even more opportunities on probably good teams in a lot of cases as well, where we have these kind of secondary or backup goaltenders emerging and having prolonged periods of relevance for fantasy hockey. So I just think that there will always be these options for you throughout the course of the season. May there be an option for you every single time you go to the wire? Maybe not. But on average, over the course of the season, you will be able to find these goaltenders. I do have a heuristic that I've talked about, just kind of basic step by step methodology, how to pick up these goaltenders throughout the season and what to look for. I'll touch on that a little bit later, but I've been employing it throughout the last number of seasons. It's been working well for me. We can get into that later. In the meantime, though, I do want to talk just briefly about the skaters and their ADP versus performance. In this particular case, I did have to use the Cacuffle ADP, so it should be a pretty good ADP from that perspective. But using Cacuffle ADP and Cacuffle point scoring, the top 7 players by fantasy points per game all came from the first 8 players selected. So, yeah, that's pretty remarkable if you stop and think about it. Basically, we are right on about 7 of the top 8 players drafted. Only Rantanen missed that. He was 33rd in fantasy points per game, and we all know kind of what happened to Rantanen this season. It was a pretty unbelievable set of circumstances for a player and one of the weirder storylines of the NHL season. You also have to go down to player 35 on this list to find the first player that was taken outside the top 100 picks, which is kind of wild. So basically, all of the top 34 players by Kickful fantasy points per game were taken within the top 100 picks. So those are obviously really valuable picks because that's where the top players are all coming from. So if you start to look at this a little more tightly, I guess, outside of the top 36 draft. Maybe I'll phrase it this way. Only 11 of the top 36 players, so again, by fantasy points per game, only 11 of the top 36 players by fantasy points per game. So say your top 3 rounds in a 12-team league, right? 3 rounds in 12-team league, 36 players. Only 11 of those 36 players by fantasy points per game were drafted outside the top 36. This is way more impressive when you consider that you're essentially playing the top 36 players drafted versus the entire rest of the NHL, and 25 out of those 36 actually beat the entire rest of the NHL and return top 36 value. That's just tremendous, tremendous stuff. It's such a safe investment, and the skaters in the top 36. Yeah, what can I say? It makes so much sense to be investing your top picks, especially those top 3 rounds are so critical and very easy to hit on relative to anything else you might find later, but also obviously leaning into your skaters there. And then if you go deeper than that, if you go through the top 100 players by ADP, so the top 100 players drafted, only 28 out of those top 100 players did not return top 100 fantasy points per games played. 72 out of the top 100 players finished in the top 100 in fantasy points per games played. So again, you just see this case where the top players, your top picks in your draft, the top skaters, time and time again, they are some of the safest bets you can make. Maybe they don't return exactly what you hope for, but they're not submarining your season in the way that, that UC Saros pick may have if you drafted him in the top 100. All right, that's enough about skaters. This is goalie episode. I also just wanted to kind of throw this in here to highlight the variability in your fantasy playoffs. So if your playoffs were in weeks 22 through 24, I pulled the total couple points for the goaltenders in that date range. You have Jake Ottinger, Philip Gustafson, Darcy Kemper, Andrei Vasilevsky, Jordan Binnington, Linus Allmark, Anthony Stolarz, Joey Decord, James Reimer shows up here, Aiden Hill, Karol Vejmelka, Sam Montembeault, Cam Talbot, Ilya Sorokin, Casey DeSmith, even though he only played 4 games, had a terrific run in here as well. Mackenzie Blackwood again. Um, you have to go even further than that. Jacob Markstrom, Kelvin Pickard, and then you get Connor Hellebuck. So if you got there with Connor Hellebuck just carrying you all season long, but your playoffs were weeks 22 through 24, Hellebuck was not that good during this stretch. This is one of the worst stretches of play. Probably was the worst stretch of play for Connor Hellebuck all season long, and it came in your fantasy playoffs. I have to imagine that absolutely killed a lot of teams' playoff chances. Igor Shesterkin even further down here. So even though he was getting some pretty big volume, he had an 888 save percentage in weeks 22 through 24. Absolutely tanked some teams for sure in the fantasy playoffs. So yeah, and one more, not on the list on the visual here on YouTube, but UC Saros was ranked 40th in total a couple points in this stretch. So just brutal stuff from a lot of really highly ranked goalies. Just once again highlights the variability of these goaltenders, especially when you absolutely have to have them in the playoff weeks. If you are depending on these players, if you are devoting a lot of draft capital to these players, you want to be pretty sure that they're going to return value relative to their peers at this time of year, and you're just not seeing it with goaltenders. If your playoffs were weeks 23 through 25, the number one goaltender was Anthony Stolarz. Hellebuck did return in this stretch, so you once again kind of see the duality of it. Wasn't good in weeks 22 through 24, but 23 through 25 he was good. So especially week 25, if you made it to week 25 with Hellebuck, then he was great again, and you're happy about that. Then Darcy Kemper, you have Jet Greaves with his monstrous week 25, 5 games played, posts a 975 save percentage, scores 61.8, a couple points in 5 games played. Just tremendous stuff from him. Jake Ottinger, Dustin Wolf, Sam Montembeault, Andrei Vasilevsky, James Reimer's here again. James Reimer, if you had the guts to roster him, got a tremendous amount of volume for Buffalo down the stretch. It was an 897 save percentage. It wasn't great from that perspective, but the total games played was all there. Allmark, Talbot, Vejmelka, Sorokin, Decord, Binnington, Pickard, Gustafson, Hill, Markstrom, yeah, it's just Sturkin, Forsberg, Woll, DeSmith, Jari. Blackwood wasn't good in this stretch. He's down here. Dostal, Saros again, way down the list. Anyway, just want to highlight that Stolarz number 1, Greaves number 4, Reimer number 9 in total couple fantasy points in weeks 23 through 25. Just some unreal goaltender performances from unlikely spots in your fantasy playoffs. Worth highlighting. All right. One more thing here. I did this last year as well, but I think it's worth renewing. I know that we have new listeners who probably didn't catch this episode last year, so maybe this is something you've heard before if you've followed the ZeroG draft strategy for a number of years at this point, but a lot of frequently asked questions that I get. One of the most common, what do we do in Cats leagues? How do we adapt ZeroG? Really, it obviously depends on your cats. I've talked about this a bit throughout the year, but if your categories favor volume a little bit more, like if you have wins and saves and only one rate stat, like save percentage, then probably you're looking for more volume and a good team to get those wins. If, on the other hand, if say your categories were wins, goals against average, and save percentage, then 2 out of your 3 categories are now rate stats, and now you're looking for goaltenders who can provide you good rate stats, but even if they're part of a tandem, it might be worthwhile to have a goaltender that is, a 1A, 1B situation or a true 50-50 split, like a Stolarz, for example, like, even Frederick Anderson, maybe Pyotr Kochekov. They're famous for that 50-50 split. Maybe it'd be more interested in that if you think they're going to give you better rate stats. They're on a good team, good defensive environment, good goalie environment. Maybe they're not giving you the volume, but you'd rather have that in a categories league where you have goals against average and save percentage as two of your three categories. So that's how you want to think about it. You want to think about what your categories are and how to adapt your strategy for that. Um, I don't think the overall thesis of zero G changes. I still think you're trying to find these goaltenders later on in your drafts, but I do think that you want to be cognizant of what your categories are, similar to how you would evaluate it for skaters. I have people saying, my points league just has this unbelievably high points weight on goaltenders, and so now I have to draft them early, right? And here I would say no. Basically, the points weight on goaltenders in your league doesn't improve their reliability or predictability, or the fact that goaltenders emerge and have good seasons from the undrafted, sections or the lower ranked sections in your draft. So once again, you would still have Philip Gustafson would rank better, would score more points in a points league that heavily favors goaltenders, right? So the points weight just increases the points scored by goaltenders. It doesn't make the top goaltenders better in that regard. So I wouldn't change the strategy really based on points weight. I would just maybe, if the points weight is so significant, maybe you are rostering more goaltenders based on that, and you're actively looking to get more volume. If it's very volume based and kind of forgiving on the goals against, those are the more so the kinds of things I'm thinking about rather than just the true points weight. The true points weight does not make me deviate from zero G. Another question I commonly get is, what round is it okay to draft a goalie in? Would love for it to be that simple. It's not. As I mentioned, in that kind of just brief statement, the elevator pitch statement for zero G. I really do think that what you're trying to do is still continue to correctly evaluate the upside versus risk profile, versus while keeping in mind basically the replaceability of the position, right? So we know that we can get similar value later on, and so the upside is not nearly as enticing when you think that, probably there is similar upside going to be on my waiver wire at points throughout the season, and I'm confident in my own ability to go find that. If you are confident in your own ability to find that, then that reduces the allure of the upside of that goaltender, whatever round it is, right? So that might give you more reason to go with a skater, even if it's already the 10th round. Maybe you're like, I can fade these goaltenders even further because I'm that confident in my ability to find a goaltender on the wire throughout the season. If you're less confident, maybe that upside of a goaltender that you think is in a good spot, maybe that upside versus risk profile is starting to make a little bit more sense to you a little bit earlier in the draft. For myself, I can share my own perspective. I'm pretty confident in my ability to find players. I mentioned, in 16 team tier one Cacuffle, my goaltenders were Mackenzie Blackwood and Joey Decord. Found them throughout the season. You can do that in a 16 team league versus tremendous competition. If I can do that, I have faith that you can do that in whatever league you find yourself in. So I do think that for myself, I don't feel the need to draft goaltenders until I'm pretty underwhelmed with the upside potential of the skaters on the board. And so I'm oftentimes just taking shot after shot after shot on skaters that I like the profile on, because I feel a lot more confident in my ability to find at least one. If one of my last, say I take skaters in rounds 10 through 12, where somebody else takes a goaltender in that range or two goaltenders in that range, even if one of those three is only one of those three skaters hits for me, but actually hits for me in a pretty significant way, then I'm pretty comfortable in my ability to find the goaltenders to approximate the production that somebody else got from drafting goaltenders in that 10 through 12 range. But now I have a skater that's hit in a big way from that 10 through 12 range that the other person who devoted that draft capital to goaltenders just didn't have access to by virtue of the position they were selecting. And so for me, that's kind of always been my calculus, is as long as there's a player on the board here that I'm still excited about, a skater that's on the board that I'm still excited about the upside potential for, I'm probably going that route 9 times out of 10. The other question that people often ask is how do you decide which goaltenders to draft? For me, in a lot of cases, I'm first looking at volume. I'm looking for volume starters. I'm not looking for goaltenders that are only going to give me one game in some weeks. It's just so hard for a goaltender who's only getting one start in a week to really influence your week, your matchup. It's just so much harder if they're not getting volume for them to be useful. They have to be really, really good to be useful if they're routinely only getting one start a week. And so I am looking for volume as kind of my number one consideration, but I'm also looking for team situation, coaching style. Do they have good defensive players? Have they, made some changes in the offseason that I'm really excited about the direction of the team? Do they look like an up and coming team under the hood where, they could take a step next year and that could really change the outlook of this team? There's things like that. Team situation, I think, is another really key attribute to look at. I do not personally look at any goaltender stats. I know there are some advanced stats out there that guys like, Blake has had Kevin Woodley on. I respect his ability to evaluate goaltenders and, what may fit in certain systems better than others. For myself, I don't have stats that are predictive. I have tested some goaltender stats, what's widely available, and none of it is really predictive year to year based on what I'm able to see. And so, if the stats are not predictive in any way, I'm not interested in using them in my decision making. I'm much more interested in just going for that volume, trying to do my best to assess team situations. I think I've gotten fairly good at that, made some good predictions on team fronts in the last few years. And so I have been a little bit more willing to base my goaltender draft decisions on those factors rather than any single goaltender stat that's out there. And then the heuristic that I mentioned previously for choosing waiver wire goalies, if I do need a goaltender for this week, maybe it's a heavy week where you can't actually fit a lot of skaters in for your streamers. And so you are looking to add a goaltender. Maybe your goaltender got injured. Maybe your goaltender sucks and you're looking to replace him. But what I'm looking for when I go to the waiver wire to try to pick up a goaltender, I'm looking for at least 2 starts expected in the next week. If I'm picking up midweek, then I'm looking ahead over the next number of games, maybe a week out from the day that I'm picking them up. It doesn't have to be an exact week, Monday to Sunday, an exact matchup, but at least 2 starts expected in the next 7 days or so. And then I'm kind of looking at the team situation and the opponents, and I'm looking at my player versus the other 2 start options, the other goaltenders that I think are likely to get 2 starts, and just evaluating them on the basis of team situation, the opponents that they're likely to play based on start patterns. That's kind of what I'm looking at. I really focus on what I think a goaltender can give me in the short term and then kind of let the long term of it play out. That has worked for me. I've found goaltenders this way continually. Just going for goaltenders that are going to give me the starts when I need them. And then if they continue to play well, I keep them. If they don't play well, then I drop them and I move on to the next thing. And throughout the course of the season, often by mid-season, I've started to hit on at least one goaltender who I end up holding at least for a pretty significant chunk of time. Oftentimes I end up with a situation like I had in the Tier 1 Cupful where I end up with a Blackwood Decord tandem, and that's pretty much my fantasy roster at goaltender for the rest of the season, which obviously sets you up well to continue to stream skaters really hard. You absolutely do have to put some time into this. If that's not you, if you're not in a spot to, devote some time to really evaluating your goaltender options when you need to make those ads, then maybe this isn't for you. And you have to, take the variance that you may get with some less obvious options, in my view. That's definitely fair. But I'm trying to tell you what I think is the best way to approach it. Whether or not that works for you and your life and your willingness to devote all of your spare time to fantasy hockey, that's definitely fair if that's not you. Um, yeah, definitely, you can just go in and check the recent game log for their team, the trend of the starts, if is it a true 50-50? Are they just going back and forth between these two guys? Or is this guy, did he get the last two starts and there wasn't because of some back-to-back situation. It was just that it looks like now they're starting to lean on this guy a little bit more. Those are the guys that I love to jump on because it does seem to look like they might start to take over the net a little bit more if it has been more of a true tandem previously. So, a little bit there on some frequently asked questions and the heuristic that I use in season. And last here, in terms of the fun stuff, early predictions for ZeroG goalies for 2025-26. So last year I did this, and honestly, I kind of crushed it. Last year, I did it at this time as well. Obviously, we didn't have a lot of information. Playoffs were still going on. We didn't know what the goaltender situations were going to be in the next year. So I was more so picking teams rather than individual goaltenders. But last year, the teams that I was interested in, the team situations that I thought would be beneficial for goaltenders, I picked Los Angeles, New Jersey, Seattle, and Minnesota. So Los Angeles and New Jersey, this was obviously before Darcy Kemper gets traded there and before Jacob Markstrom goes to New Jersey. So, take that for what it's worth. But I was interested in both those spots in a big way before those moves happened. Obviously, Darcy Kemper hits as a later goaltender in a big way. I think I said 20th in ADP at the start of the season. So huge win there for ZeroG with Darcy Kemper. Markstrom was drafted a little bit higher. Didn't have the terrific season, did battle injury at times throughout. But Jake Allen, when he was in, was actually pretty good. And so maybe you got a run of play from Jake Allen in your league. The Devils were definitely a good situation there. If you actually go back to last year's episode, my ZeroG episode this time last year, I kind of called Philip Gustafson. I said I thought he'd be a bounce back, kind of low key bounce back, I think was the phrasing I use. And so that obviously came true in a big way. And Gustafson was one of the ZeroG heroes for a lot of teams this year. And I called Joey Decord kind of like a goalie of interest. I did say, I was a little bit agnostic to him and Grubauer in that situation, but I was hopeful that the Seattle imminent coaching change, would result in something good in the Seattle net. But Decord obviously took that net and ran with it. And even though the team actually had a pretty terrible season, Decord was still one of the better goalies for fantasy hockey for much of the season. So what I've got for this year, I think I'm going to go with four teams again here. I'll go with the Anaheim. Greg Cronin is fired. Hopeful for whatever they bring in there that it's just a much more sane situation. If you I talked about this on one of the other episodes recently as well, but if you look at what Columbus was able to do with the turnaround this year with a lot of young talent that just hadn't quite put it all together yet, I do view Anaheim in a similar lens. I think they have a lot of similar qualities with their roster as currently constructed. And so yeah, I do think that John Gibson is moved in the offseason finally, another year off the contract. I think that makes it a little bit more palatable, a little bit easier to move this offseason. It feels pretty obvious that he's done with Anaheim and Anaheim is kind of done with him. So many injuries. I just feel like they'll find a way to get him out of Anaheim this offseason, which I believe would make Lucas Dostal a kind of true starter. Maybe not 60 plus games like the Shesterkins and Hellebucks of the world, but maybe 55, 50 to 55, I would feel reasonably confident in if Gibson is moved. And so I do think that Dostal could be a really, really good ZeroG candidate next year. I will go with Columbus here. I think Merzlikins, another goaltender that could get moved this offseason. There's been rumblings about it. Last offseason, it sounded like he wanted to get moved, but they didn't really find anything for him. He's still got years on his contract, but he was pretty terrible down the stretch. I think they're pretty done with him. I think they'll find a way. Maybe they eat some money, but they want him out of the room. And so I think that may happen. Jet Greaves has this incredible run at the end of the season here. Is he the guy? Jet Greaves is a wild tale. If you go back and look at this guy's stats, like Barry Colts, his last OHL stop, Barry Colts 2019-20, he's 24 years old. his last OHL stop, 2019-20 season, Barrie Colts. This is a team that was just above 500, so not great, not terrible. Plays 33 games for them there, has an 888 save percentage, just brutal save percentage there. Goes to the AHL, split time between the AHL and ECHL the following year, more so in the AHL, 905 in the A and 907 in the E. Plays one game for the Blue Jackets, and it was pretty great. Posted 939 save percentage there. Then 22-23, plays 43 games for Cleveland in the AHL, 899 save percentage, so still nothing crazy there. Does play 9 games for the Blue Jackets in 23-24 and posts a 908 with the Blue Jackets, so not too bad there. Oh, sorry, that's 23-24. So, yeah, in 23-24, he plays 9 games, gets a cup of coffee with the Columbus Blue Jackets, 908 save percentage. In the AHL, plays 46 games in 23-24, 910 save percentage, so looking better. Then this past season, 24-25, 40 games in the AHL, posts a 920 save percentage down there, and obviously comes up for the Blue Jackets, plays 11 games, 938 save percentage in those 11 games. Jet Greaves, yeah, just such a linear ascent. And yeah, from where he was in junior, you would never expect that he could be that where he's gotten to today. But I love the story. I'm all in if they decide to go with Jet Greaves. I kind of don't think they will. I think they'll add a veteran and probably let him start, but maybe Greaves takes over at some point in the season. Tarasov also in the mix there as well, was supposed to be the goaltender of the future there for a while. Maybe it still happens. Not going to rule that out, but yeah, definitely interesting times in the Columbus net, and I'm very interested into who the opening night starter might be there. Utah is another one. I think Utah could take another big step. I've heard some rumblings that Utah could take a big swing in free agency this offseason. They might be another top 4 defenseman away from, kind of nailing things down on the back end, but I think they may go out and make that happen this offseason as well. Krova here is a UFA, so we'll have to see what happens there. I think they probably want to bring him back, but you also have Connor Ingram. Obviously, personal tragedy for him this year, took time away from the team, and we'll have to see. But, he was doing really well in 23-24 for long stretches. Maybe he can bounce back and be a difference maker for fantasy in 25-26. I'm not going to rule that out either. Either way, very interesting net situation in Utah, and a team that I think could take another step in 25-26 and make that a really inviting environment for a goaltender. And then lastly here, Philadelphia, if they get the coaching figured out here, I do think they have the horses on D. You have Minchkov, who I think will take another step offensively. They could win some games with his offense, maybe add some more there in free agency. Obviously, I'm looking for them to add another goaltender here. I don't really think they have the goaltender of the future on the roster at this moment in time. So hopefully they do get another goaltender that we can feel reasonable about this offseason. If Vejmelka doesn't get done in Utah, maybe Vejmelka goes to Philadelphia and we could actually feel halfway decent about his prospects there. Either way, I do think that Philadelphia could be a little bit better this season. Maybe not even a playoff team, but just better. And they could have a bounce back in terms of what they can bring to the goaltender position next year. I think that some people may comment below who you think, or player takes or team situations that you think could be ZeroG situations next year. But I think Yaroslav Askarov may be a sexy pick in San Jose. But when I look at that blue line, I think it needs probably 3 top 4 defensemen before I can really get behind that take. I think Askarov has a really bright future. I just don't know that it's going to be next year right away, unless they really retool that blue line completely this offseason in a way that I feel good about. So I think we can be excited about the future for Askarov, but I don't know that it's going to happen quite this season upcoming. So yeah, I think if you've made it this far in the episode, I think you understand where I'm coming from, what I think. But I think the takeaway here is pretty clear. Once again, in 24-25, ZeroG has proven itself to be the easiest leg up on your competition that fantasy can provide. I have yet to encounter a cogent or well-reasoned opposition to the strategy that really makes me question anything about it as I've laid it out here. And yeah, as I mentioned in my year-end accountability episode that came out last week, I employed this strategy in all my leagues. They're all pretty high-level leagues. 16-team Tier 1 Cupful, I'll keep saying it. I finished first in the regular season, was able to get Blackwood and Decord off the waiver wire in season. I didn't finish worse than fourth in the regular season standings in any of my leagues, employing this strategy. If your stance is that ZeroG is just fundamentally incorrect as a theory or flawed as a theory, then I guess I am just an unbelievably talented fantasy manager that I'm just performing this well in these high-level leagues while exclusively employing ZeroG. I'll take the compliment, but I think I'd rather you just adopt the strategy. All right. If you made it this far in the episode, you should click the link in the description, join the Discord community, come talk goalies. We can commiserate. We can try to predict good situations for goaltenders for next year. Like, rate, review, subscribe, comment, whatever you can do for us. That really would help us out, especially in the off season where everything kind of slows down a bit. So if you are still out here thinking about fantasy hockey, already trying to get better for the 2025-26, if you could do one of those things for us, we really would appreciate that. That is going to be all that I've got for this episode. Hopefully it brought you some value, helped you get a little bit better at fantasy hockey today. All the advanced stats you heard today came from Natural Stat Trick, which is a terrific free resource. And actually, I did pull all the normal stats from Natural Stat Trick as well. Many thanks to the band there for supplying the music for the podcast. Be sure to check out their Spotify as well. That's it, folks. Much love.